I have selected the 1906 earthquake and Great Fire of San Francisco for a comprehensive look because it contains all of the elements of the modus operandi of the reset to a new false historical narrative from the original worldwide advanced civilization, and concerning how the new narrative was superimposed on top of existing infrastructure. My name is Michelle Gibson. This is what we are told about this famous historical event. A very large earthquake struck the coast of Northern California early in the morning of Wednesday, April 18, 1906. High-intensity shaking was felt from Eureka, California, which is the principal city of what is called the Redwood Empire region of California, and the largest coastal city between San Francisco and Portland, Oregon. This is the main channel leading into Humboldt Bay and Eureka on the top left, compared with the channel at Port Mansfield in South Texas near Port Isabel, Texas, on the Gulf of Mexico on the top right, the channel leading into Venice, Florida on the Gulf of Mexico on the bottom left, and the south inlet of the Grand Lucayan Waterway on Grand Bahama Island in the Caribbean Sea on the bottom right. The headquarters of the Six Rivers National Forest are in Eureka, of which a section is pictured on the top left, compared with the confluences of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers near St. Louis on the top right, of the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers near Des Moines, Iowa on the bottom left, and of the Blue Nile and White Nile near Khartoum in the African country of Sudan on the bottom right. The California Parks headquarters for the North Coast Redwoods District is in Eureka. The Carson Mansion is a nationally recognized landmark in Eureka, said to have been built starting in 1884 and completed in 1886 for lumber baron William Carson. It has been a private club since 1950 and is not open to the general public. William Carson was said to have arrived in San Francisco in 1849 from New Brunswick in Canada with a group of other woodsmen. In 1850, the year I believe was year one of the new historical narrative, he and Jerry Whitmore were said to have felled a tree, the first for commercial purposes on Humboldt Bay. In 1854, he was said to have shipped the first load of redwood timber to San Francisco, and in 1863, he and John Dolbear formed the Dolbear and Carson Lumber Company. William Carson was also said to have been involved with the founding of the Eel River and Eureka Railroad in November of 1882, along with a man named John Vance. Its service was said to have been stopped for safety reasons between 1996 and 1997. Here's a building in Old Town Eureka on the top left, which was said to be known for its Victorian architecture, compared with Fort Madison in Iowa on the top right, and Kherson, Ukraine on the bottom. The high-intensity shaking was said to have been felt to the Salinas Valley, an agricultural region south of the San Francisco Bay Area and one of the most productive agricultural regions in California. John Steinbeck sets many of his novels in Salinas, as he was born here in 1902, and lived here until the age of 17. This was his home, and which is still there today, and is a restaurant at the corner of Stone Street and Central Avenue. Initially, the epicenter of the earthquake was said to be in Olema, in the Point Reyes area. This is Arch Rock at Sculptured Beach on Point Reyes. Arch Rock, and Sculptured Beach for that matter, are cover-up code words for ancient infrastructure that we are told is natural. There are similar features to Arch Rock on Point Reyes in many different places, like Hollow Rock Beach on Grand Portage Island off the coast of Minnesota in Lake Superior. This is Durdle Door in England on the winter solstice. These archways are what I would consider ancient infrastructure, placed precisely a certain way in the landscape for the alignment of heaven and earth, and are not the result of natural and random processes as we have been led to believe. And Keyhole Rock on Pfeiffer Beach in California, also on the winter solstice. These archways represent intentional terraforming of the earth from ancient times by master builders to create harmony, beauty, and balance based on geometric and astronomical principles. In the 1960s, it was proposed that the epicenter was offshore, northwest of the Golden Gate, which was the name given to the strait between San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean, which was said to be supported by a tide gauge at the Presidio recording a local tsunami at the time of the occurrence of the 1906 earthquake. The Presidio of San Francisco was a former U.S. military installation and park in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. This is the Battery Boutel at the Presidio, said to have been built in 1900, and which looks a lot like the Alexandra Battery in Bermuda, said to have been constructed in the 1860s. Based on what I have found in my research, I believe structures like these called batteries actually functioned as batteries on the planetary grid, and were not originally military in nature. We are told after the earthquake, fires soon broke out in San Francisco and lasted for several days, and as a result, up to 3,000 people died, and over 80% of San Francisco was destroyed. Here are some photos of San Francisco prior to the 1906 earthquake and fire. And photos taken at the time everything was happening. I find it interesting to note the photos showing well-dressed people that seem to be calmly hanging out in the midst of all the destruction. I wonder what that was all about. We are told that up to 300,000 people were left homeless out of a population of 410,000. Half of those evacuated were said to have fled across the San Francisco Bay to Oakland and Berkeley, apparently with the help of the Southern Pacific Railroad, running 1,400 trains, starting 45 minutes after the earthquake occurred, in the midst of chaos and destruction for the next 5 days. Notwithstanding this train, said to have been overturned at Point Reyes by the earthquake, with the surreal-looking girl and dog standing beside it, and leaving San Francisco by ferry. This is the San Francisco Ferry Building, said to have been designed by architect Arthur Page in 1892 and completed in 1898. For those remaining in San Francisco, makeshift tents were said to cover places like Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and the Panhandle. I just want to show you the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, located in the Marina District of San Francisco, not far from the Presidio. It was said to have been built for the Panama Pacific Exposition of 1915, an exposition which celebrated the city and its rise from the ashes, and one of its few surviving structures. Interesting to note such a massive engineering feat and event like this taking place during World War I, which took place between 1914 and 1918 in our historical narrative. The San Francisco earthquake and fire is said to be the first disaster of its magnitude to be documented by photography and motion picture footage. More about this later. We are told 90% of the total destruction of San Francisco was caused by out-of-control fires. One of the largest fires, called the Ham and Eggs Fire, was said to have been caused by a woman making breakfast for her family. This fire was said to have caused the destruction of the San Francisco City Hall, as well as the Hall of Records. This is what it looked like before and after. The Ham and Eggs Fire was also said to have destroyed the Palace Hotel. Another cause of the destructive fires was attributed to firefighters who were untrained in the use of dynamite. We are told they were trying to dynamite strategic buildings to create a firebreak, but instead caught on fire from the dynamite itself. Say what? How could that have happened? The buildings in these pictures were made from heavy stone masonry. Most of the largest botanical collection in the West was destroyed at the California Academy of Sciences, except for 1,500 specimens that were saved by botany curator Alice Eastwood. And the laboratory of biochemist Benjamin Jacobs was destroyed in the fire, where he was researching the nutrition of everyday foods. San Francisco's fire chief, Dennis T. Sullivan, was said to have died early on from injuries sustained during the earthquake. United States troops were said to have mobilized to assist, and troops from nearby Angel Island were brought in. While the military intervention was mostly above board, there were some soldiers said to have been caught looting. Plans to rebuild San Francisco were said to have been started right away, but we are told funds were not available for at least a week because all the major banks were where the fire was, and they had to wait for the fireproof vaults to cool down enough to access the money in them. The only money available was from the Bank of Italy, which was founded in San Francisco in October of 1904. This was the only bank which had evacuated its funds prior to the earthquake and fire. Did they know something? By the way, in 1929, the Bank of Italy became the Bank of America. This is a $5 national banknote issued by the Bank of Italy in 1927. National banknotes were currency banknotes issued by national banks that were chartered by the United States government. We are told the power of the earthquake destroyed almost all of the mansions on Nob Hill, except for the James C. Flood Mansion. Nob Hill has historically served as a center of San Francisco's upper class and is one of San Francisco's original 7 hills. Prior to the 1850s, it was called California Hill, but was renamed Nob Hill after the Central Pacific Railroad's Big Four, known as the Nabobs or Knobs, said to be an Anglo-Indian term for ostentatiously wealthy men. Their mansions in these pictures were said to have been destroyed by the earthquake. They were Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific Railroad; Collis P. Huntington, the vice president of the Central Pacific Railroad; Mark Hopkins, treasurer of the Central Pacific Railroad; and Charles Crocker, construction supervisor of the Central Pacific Railroad and president of Charles Crocker and Company. These 4 men used their immense wealth and power to dominate politics and commerce in San Francisco and California. Where did their wealth come from? We are told it came from first selling supplies for the California Gold Rush of 1849 to 1851. Then they were said to have funded the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. When they became directors of the Central Pacific Railroad, they became immensely wealthy and the most powerful men in California. You can also find them referred to as robber barons, along with other prominent individuals of this era. Robber baron is defined as a person who has become rich through ruthless and unscrupulous business practices, originally with reference to prominent U.S. businessmen in the 19th century. Was this how they got so rich? There's so much more revealing information to be found in 1906 San Francisco, and I could go on and on. I will wrap things up at this point, however, with my thoughts on great fires and the like. I believe humanity was on the completely different and positive timeline of the ancient Moorish civilization up until relatively recently. This civilization built all of the infrastructure on the earth in alignment with sacred geometry and universal law to create harmony and balance between heaven and earth. This is the great seal of the Moors, and ab antiquo means from antiquity. Islam is a word that means peace, and Moors greet each other by saying peace or Islam. The eye at the top of the pyramid represents the human pineal gland and reconnecting spiritually with one's higher self. The beings behind the hijack of the timeline based much in the new historical narrative on the Moorish legacy, but twisted and subverted from its original meaning. I think they created the worldwide mudflood cataclysm in order to wipe out this civilization and create a new historical narrative with an aim of controlling and dominating humanity. In this process, they created the means to suck up all of the vast wealth of this civilization. Continuing on into the present day, I believe there is a connection between the Great Frost of Ireland in 1740 and 1741 and the mudflood cataclysm. During this time in Ireland, there was an almost 2-year period of extremely cold, enduring weather. The cause is not known, and this information is in the historical record, but kept pretty much out of sight. I believe it took approximately 100 years to dig out enough infrastructure out of the mudflows in order to restart civilization, and that the official kickoff of the new historical timeline was the Great Exhibition of All Nations in London in 1851. Held in the Crystal Palace, said to have been constructed in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition and then moved to another part of London afterwards. What if all of the exhibitions, expositions, and world fairs, starting with this one in 1851, were showcasing the technology and architectural wonders of the original civilization before being hidden away or forever destroyed? What if the original order of society was turned upside down, and we have been the subjects of a vast human and social engineering project, not for our best interest, but that of other beings? How did the great fires of history factor into all of this? I believe up until the advent of photography, the fires were a fictional device inserted into our history to create the narrative of destruction of sacred and important places. Like in Rome's Great Fire of 64 AD, it started right next to the location where Circus Maximus and the Roman imperial palaces were built. And the location of Constantinople's fire of 532 AD has similar characteristics, including the Hippodrome, which served the same purpose as the Circus Maximus in Rome, and the imperial Great Palace of Constantinople, also known as the Sacred Place. I think later fires of the 1800s, for example, the 1845 Great Fire of New York, were inserted into our history to create the narrative that wood structures burned and were replaced by heavy masonry. We are told the 1845 Great Fire of New York destroyed 345 buildings in the southern part of the financial district. This fire was said to confirm the effectiveness of restricting the building of wood frame structures, as areas which were rebuilt after the 1835 Great Fire of New York, were of stone, masonry, iron roofs, and iron shutters. What about the Great Fires that have photographic and video evidence? I think these represent something else entirely. What could cause the complete destruction of stone masonry, like what you see from the 1871 Great Fire of Chicago? And the 1906 San Francisco fire? Can a regular fire do this kind of destruction? In this process of rewriting history, a corporatocracy was created, which is a society or system that is governed or controlled by corporations. It was superimposed onto the existing infrastructure. This is Newspaper Row in New York City. The New York World Building in the right foreground was raised in 1955 for, we are told, the expanded car ramp entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. A marvel of human engineering torn down for a car ramp entrance? Does this make sense? I'm going to be starting a new series in the next video focusing on how the famous authors and art of the 1800s and 1900s were used to shape the new and false historical narrative.